concentrating in international relations. My track is the security and society track, and my regional focus is Asia, in particular China and Southeast Asia. I've had some previous research experience. When I was studying abroad last semester in the Chinese University of Hong Kong, I conducted the Global Independent Studies Project Research, which is it's kind of like GLISP, but you do it abroad. And I was working on the topic of the psychology of Chinese diplomacy and foreign policy. At that time, my advisor was from the CLIPS department, Professor Brian Hayden. So it's just kind of like an intersectionality between politics, international relations, and the field of psychology, because I do have overlapping interests within both disciplines. So that being said, I've also assisted Professor Matthew Gutman from the Watson Institute. He worked with anthropology issues about China, in particular about gender equality and gender perceptions in China. So that being said, I really found China to be a very interesting place in this world. For many reasons, and I mean, a lot of us would agree with the point being made that China is definitely one of the biggest rising powers in the world. Perhaps some might contend that they're not exactly the superpowers yet, but definitely rising powers. So that being said, it's important to talk about China not just in terms of economic growth, because obviously the most apparent growth that China is projecting right now is within the economic fields. We see them globally trading around the world everywhere. Their networks is vast, and in 2013, I believe one researcher is already saying that China is basically the world's largest trading nation over the United States. So a lot of prominence that China is projecting right now, but I want to talk tonight a little bit more on the let's discuss side sometimes. Scholars argue a lot about China's economic growth, but I kind of want to talk about the security aspect of it today. And in particular, the nuclear security aspect of the issue. And China's nuclear strategy, I think the first thing that we would have to ask is, does China even have a nuclear strategy? It has a nuclear arsenal, it has nuclear capabilities, but whether it's just the fact that they're just, making sure that they are not behind the other superpowers and making sure that, security-wise, they still have some weapons ready. We need to question whether it's just that, or they actually have a long-term strategy or a tactic that they're currently employing in order to actually deal impacts in an active manner, not just a passive, deterrent, defensive kind of a manner. So yeah, if you don't mind, can I switch to my PowerPoint? Is it?
Yeah. Yeah.
So when talking about China, I kind of want to call it the phantom tactic, and I will elaborate more later, and it will become a bit more obvious why I decided to call it that. But basically the idea is, again, we don't know yet what exactly is China doing with their nuclear capabilities right now. And that being said, this can be a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing. Tonight, I kind of want us to step out of our comfort zone a little bit and kind of discuss it in a bit more grim manner, in the sense that maybe China has a purpose in keeping things in the dark. Maybe there's a reason for them not, being too apparent right now in the way that they project their nuclear posture. So that being said, a couple of overviews about how I'm gonna proceed with tonight's presentation. So first, I'm going to discuss about the category of nuclear posture that China has selected. And I'm going to use the model that a scholar named Naram is using. Basically, there are going to be three main categories that are being displayed around the world, and I'm going to discuss in particular which model did China choose, and the reasons behind it, and how this particular posture that they selected is going to be the most effective for them. And then secondly, I'm going to discuss about China's utilization and enhancement of second strike capability, but not just in the sense that it's going to deter nuclear attacks from other nations, but also how it can actually buttress and reinforce their conventional forces. In today's world, ever since the United States used the nuclear weapon in Second World War, we have not seen yet nuclear weaponry being used in actual combat. So that being said, conventional forces are usually still the means to achieving military political objectives. So how does their nuclear tactic actually incorporate into the use of their conventional force tactic? That's something that's interesting to look at also. And lastly, I want to discuss about how China is co-opting other nations' postures within their nuclear strategies as part of its own security strategy. So how does China first influence other nations into shaping their nuclear posture, and how China is taking advantage of that posture that other nations selected and building their own nuclear strategy. So that's kind of like the roadmap of my presentation for tonight. And that being said, I want to start with an anecdote, basically, with two of them. So I'm sure we've all heard about Sun Tzu being fought, The Art of War by Sun Tzu. But there's also actually another Chinese tactician, very famous back then, that sometimes people kind of overlook, and his name is Sun Bin. He also wrote, it's actually called The Art of War also, and some scholars believe that it was actually kind of like a continuation of Sun Tzu's Art of War. Some argue that it might be a separate thing, but the point is he's also a very famous tactician, especially during the Warring States period. Two particular stories that I want to share. So the first one is the Battle of Guilin. And then what happened there is, so Sun Bin works for the state of Qi. And then at that time, the state of Qi is in alliance with the state of Zhao, the blue state in the map. They were both confronting the invasion forces of Wei. So Wei at that time was trying to besiege the capital city of Zhao. They sent their besieging army there. So Zhao, naturally they asked Qi to help relieve the siege, basically. But instead, what Sun Bin did is, instead of using the conventional way of bringing your army and then go to the besieged capital city and try to relieve it, he instead went to Wei and attacked Wei's capital. And by doing this, he's drawing away all the Wei forces that are besieging the Zhao's capital, because their own capital is being attacked. So they have to abandon their invasion, their campaign, and go back home. And along the way home, Sun Bin has set up traps here and there, skirmishes, to basically wear them down. And by the time they reach their own capital, they're weak already because of the numerous skirmishes, and they were easily defeated. So that's the Battle of Guilin. The next battle is the Battle of Maling, and then it's, once again, Sun Bin is kind of implementing this very unconventional, unorthodox tactic. So what he did at that time is, this time, Qi is finding itself allied with Han, and Wei is once again attacking. What Sun Bin did is, he kind of set up his army to retreat once they encountered the Wei forces. So the Wei force began to chase them. But along the way, what Sun Bin did is, every time they make camps, when they leave the camp, they make sure that they leave less equipments behind. So less cooking materials, less food behind. So this gives the image to the Wei forces that there is probably like a disease going on, that the Wei forces is decreasing, or some of them deserted. It gives an impression that there is less and less force within the G-force. And then at the end of it, you know, the wave force is basically finding themselves underestimating Sun Bin's force. And Sun Bin then set up a trap at Maling, and that's where he crushed them because, again, the wave forces were not prepared to confront an army of larger size. They expected, you know, an easier victory at that time. So what's the takeaway lesson from these two stories that I'm trying to implement within, you know, contemporary nuclear strategy? It's the idea of misdirection, basically. It's the idea of winning even before you do anything. It's the idea of using something smaller, you know, something sometimes that people might think it's trivial, but it worked, right? And in battle, in warfare, in strategy, it doesn't matter how you do it as long as you get the results, you know, in a sense. So I want to relate these two particular stories to the fact that right now, the most apparent trait of China's nuclear capabilities is the fact that it's small. Relatively speaking, compared to many other countries, nuclear powers around the world, it's small. If you look at it within the graph under the table on the right, it's taken in 2013, the survey by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. So the USA, clearly on the top, the deployed warheads, it's amounting over 2,000, and they still have other warheads available. And the term deployed means that the warheads are already placed on the missiles, so they're kind of like ready to go. Russia is next, it's 1,800. And after that we have the UK and France, a huge decrease already, 160, and then there's also 290. But then there's China. There's not much information we have on the deployed warheads, but like approximately, you know, they have 250 other warheads. And if you look at the graph on the left, you know, that's taken a little bit old. That's an older table, but you know, they estimate that the deployed warheads is around 130. We can expect some fluctuations already by then, by 2013, but it's not going to be as significant as in comparison to the American force of 2,000 plus. And if you look at the world, you know, most people would still like to think that the United States still has a lot of pull within the European continent. And we still like to believe that in terms of security, the United States still works a lot with Europe, so with the UK, with France. So if you add up, you know, it's 2,150, you add up 160 and 290 from UK and France, add into it the other warheads, that's a lot. In comparison to China's 250. So the question is, what's China doing? Is it actually just the fact that they just want to have it to show the world that, you know what, we're not that far behind, you know, we still have some stuff to hit you back. And, you know, within the last national parade, we can see them parading their nuclear weaponries. And the objective of that is to show they can hit Taiwan, they can hit Guam, you know, they have long distance capabilities. But at the same time, it's still small. Is it just for show? Is it just to deter? Is it just to tell the United States that if you strike, we can at least hit you back and cause some damages in New York, Washington, something like that? Is it just that, or is there something behind the small number that we need to take into account? So that being said, you know, the question becomes how to convert small arsenal into large impacts. So again, like I said earlier, V.P. Narang is the scholar that I would like to use this theory of posture optimization theory. He basically said that there are three main categories to the different postures displayed around the world. So the first one is the catalytic posture. The idea is you want to weaponize more arsenal in order to encourage the third-party patron to operate on one's behalf. And this is kind of like what the Israeli is trying to operate on. For example, you know, they're counting their main weapon in terms of nuclear capability is still the United States. Their alliance, their cooperation, affiliation with the United States, because the United States has far bigger arsenal. So that's the catalytic posture. The next posture is what they call the asymmetric posture. Now this is the most aggressive kind of posture out there in terms of nuclear weaponry. The idea is nuclear retaliation at any level of aggression. It can just be a political issue. It can just be a dispute over rocks and islands here and there. And if the country adopts this posture, then they are willing to use nuclear forces. Perhaps one of the main examples right now of this posture is Pakistan. But it's also important to note that Pakistan actually was not always at asymmetric posture. Before, they were actually more of the catalytic posture, but we'll see later why they decided to switch. The last one is what they call assured retaliation, and this is where China is standing right now. It's basically, you kind of try to establish a moderate policy. You kind of want to be a little bit more on the middle ground. You don't want to be too extreme. At the same time, you establish a line of aggression that must not be crossed. And then if that line is crossed, if you cross the Rubicon River, basically, then you're going to have to pay through with nuclear retaliation. So China is currently using what's called the no first use doctrine. It's basically the idea that unless you attack us first with nuclear capabilities, nuclear powers, we're not going to retaliate with our own nuclear forces. So the idea is second strike capability. And so basically, a lot of scholars argue right now that the nuclear modernization that are going on in China right now, their main objective is to allow China's arsenal to be survivable against first strike. And this involves advancements in terms of the mobility of the arsenal. So they start to develop new vehicles where they can mount the warheads basically, and they keep them moving around all the time. So it's hard to know, it's hard to pinpoint exactly at one time where is it going to be. And in terms of like nuclear attacks, if you want to attack a country with a nuclear weapon, you kind of have to attack the nuclear arsenal first, because otherwise they're going to retaliate against you. So, but then if these nuclear warheads are moving around, then it's hard for you to know where they're going to be at a future point of time. So that's the idea, that their main objective is, like scholars argue, is to increase this idea of survivability in the case that China does get attacked using nuclear forces. So why assured retaliation then? Why didn't China try to pick the other posture? Why not as asymmetric posture, or why not catalytic posture, for example? So one is the idea of international image, of course. So especially within the current regime of Xi Jinping, he's repeatedly saying in many conferences that China is a rejuvenated nation. China it's changing. They're making reforms domestically, politically, economically. Xi Jinping is very known for his, corruption-busting campaigns, and in general, the world likes to see this. So the United States likes to see that China is actually moving away from the regime of Mao, and even from the regime of Jiang Zemin, where corruptions were very rampant. So China is actually trying to improve its international image, its international stature. China is participating more within the United Nations in terms of contributing peacekeeping troops. That's a huge plus point. So they definitely do not want to utilize an aggressive nuclear tactic, because that's going to jeopardize the whole thing. The United States is going to yell at them right away, and the whole world can see, they're trying to weaponize. They're trying to proceed with like an armament kind of development. And that's not good. So Xi Jinping in 2014 emphasized basically the idea that they want to follow the approach of enhancing security for the sake of development, and promoting development by upholding security. So they're kind of trying to bandwagon with the whole trend of developing third world nations right now, assisting those third world countries, assisting developing countries. And they're trying to use their capabilities, including within the nuclear technology sector, to assist in terms of development. And so that's the whole international image. So with the assured retaliation posture, this benefits them greatly. Because why? It shows them that China, yes, China is a nuclear power, but despite our power, despite our capabilities to do damages, we decide not to do it anyway. You know, it's almost like if a robber stops you on the street and he's holding a gun, and all of a sudden he's like, you know what, I'll put the gun away. I mean, he's still a robber, but at the same time, we were almost going to be like thanking him right away, right? It's that kind of mentality. You know, like we have the capabilities, but we choose not to use it. But instead, we're going to try to use it to assist, you know, those countries that need the technology for development purposes. But at the same time, this posture also allows them to, in the case that they do get assaulted, or in the case that they do get encroached by other nations, especially in terms of like nuclear stuff, then they can play the victim. You know, they can say, look, we actually have the capabilities to strike first, but we choose not to do it. Now they're trying to take advantage of our generosity and our benevolence. And you know, the international community right away in this kind of scenario would definitely side with China, because why? They didn't attack first. So in terms of international image, it's good, but it's not just about the image, it's also about security, it's about deterring. Because any country now that tries to pick a fight with China would have to consider that, you know what, maybe the reception that the international community has towards China right nowadays, it's different than back then with Mao. It's different from the the hardline communist era. China is changing. China is becoming better per se. So it's harder. It's higher risk in terms of confronting China, and China is taking advantage of their second strike policy within the nuclear sector. Second reason, it's easy. It's relatively more economical. Despite the fact that China still needs to be considered within the security sector, it's still a very obvious fact that China's main forte right now, main strength, is still within the economy. Therefore, sacrificing too much within the economy for the purpose of building a larger arsenal is going to be stupid. And as much as China wants to build up its nuclear arsenal, you saw the comparison earlier, they have a lot to catch up with the United States to stand toe to toe. So what's the point? They can just keep a smaller arsenal, but it depends on how they actually utilize that smaller arsenal. So for China, it's better to stand on this second strike capability. It's kind of like a more defensive mode. They spend less. At the same time, they still can use, they still have an arsenal, and later on I'll explain how that arsenal, despite its smaller size, can be utilized effectively. And at the same time, it's not raising any questions from people around the world, because they have economic partners. If they put a lot of these resources into the nuclear weaponry sector, then a lot of their partners might start to raise questions like, hey, where are our money going? Like, are you using it to fund an army? Then that can jeopardize a lot of the economic networking that's going on, especially with the United States. So that's the second reason why sure retaliation is being picked. Because China realizes that it does not need to stand toe-to-toe militarily with the United States in order to compete evenly, because they have many other strengths that the United States doesn't have. One is geographical strength. If any conflict is going to happen within the United States or any other superpowers with China, it's going to take place in Asia. China is not yet ready or willing to conduct a campaign, military campaign, the way Hitler did during the Second World War, or the way Russia is trying to take over the United States. That's not the end. That's not the end goal. That's not the main objective. What they want is basically asserting regional superiority within Asia. They want to try to keep the U.S. as much, out as much as possible from Asia. They want to be the hegemon within Asia. So there's a lot of advantages that China actually possesses already by being in Asia. And they're playing on home turf. It's the same with any like sporting events. You play at home field, you have the home field advantage, really. And that way, logistically, that contributes a lot. You don't have to spend as much to mobilize your troops. Your bases are right there. And for China, the U.S. right now are relying on their carriers and some bases within allied countries. But at the same time, now China is trying to boost their economic trading with those countries, with South Korea, for example. New deals are being struck. South Korea, as of now, have not agreed to join the TPP. There are rumors going on that they might join the FTAAP instead. Within the ASEAN, they have made a lot of headways with Indonesia, which is the largest force in the ASEAN community. So that way, the Philippines and the Vietnamese, when they try to argue about South China Sea territorial disputes, they cannot go to the ASEAN community to conduct a concerted effort. So home turf advantage. And China has also made a lot of good investments in terms of military capabilities in other sectors. They've improved their radar technology lately so that they're able to better track the US carriers. And that's going to decrease a lot of the military advantages that the United States used to have. During the Cold War era, one of the biggest things that the United States was proud of is the fact that they have carriers in the Pacific. And it's, their power there, it's projecting very immensely. But now China has made good investments in terms of undermining the capabilities of those technologies and weapons that the United States possesses. So the next one is in terms of military contributions. If we want to talk about how their nuclear posture, nuclear strategy is actually working, then we also need to examine how militarily they're actually making contributions, they're actually beneficial. So I want to make the argument that there are actually contributions towards both the conventional force and the nuclear force. And I will elaborate more. So basically, the first contribution it makes is that it actually provides encouragement and reinforcement for their conventional forces. Why? And this is where the idea of a phantom is going to appear. So Chinese leaders are basically confident now that their conventional forces, if they need to use the conventional forces around the world, that they have the backing of the nuclear force capabilities. So, so this is kind of the basic idea of deterrence still. So if you engage conventionally, if you send out your ground forces anywhere else in the world, engaging with China might increase the risk of China utilizing nuclear force. But hey, you might say, wait, China said that if you don't attack them with nuclear weapons, then they're not going to use their nuclear forces, right? So how come we need to be worried about engaging China with conventional forces? This is where the second part comes in. So their second strike capabilities is actually used in tandem with their conventional forces advancements. Basically what I'm trying to say is, what China is investing a lot of in lately is in technologies that can be considered as auxiliary or supportive of their nuclear arsenal. So technically, at face value, we consider these to be conventional forces. They're not nuclear forces, but they have technology. They have technology value. They have relations in terms of operational duties that are directly linked to China's nuclear arsenal. For example, radar technology, submarine technology. Very recently, China is gifted by Great Britain the technology of the LR-7 submarine, which is considered to be the most advanced submarine technology out there. It's a rescue submarine. It's not a military submarine. But at the same time, it doesn't matter. If you get the technology, you can take it apart, right? You can take it apart. You can, adapt it within the combat nature, and it can become a very powerful submarine technology. So China is making a lot of investment in terms of these kind of like conventional forces, quote unquote. But then at the same time, they're actually very linked to the way they operate the nuclear arsenal. So this is why it's called a phantom, because it's very vague. Because even within the doctrinal book, it's like a guidebook that's provided for the 2nd Artillery Unit of the People's Liberation Army, which is the artillery unit that is in charge of the nuclear weaponry. The guidebook basically says that the no first use policy is vaguely defined, and that conventional and nuclear forces could eventually become blurred. They become integrated, they become interrelated and interlinked, basically. So an attack on conventional force by a conventional force can be considered as an attack on China's nuclear capability and China's perception. That being said, they can then justify themselves in saying that, look, okay, if that's the case, you're trying to harm our nuclear capabilities, then we are, by that, the definition that they set, the rules that they try to set, they can attack, retaliate with nuclear weaponry. Now you're going to say that, okay, China is not going to do that. It's too extreme. Okay, let's play with that kind of mindset then. But let me ask you, would anyone then still dare to try to attack conventionally, knowing that there is still some grounds available out there for China to justify their claims in retaliating with nuclear weaponry? So for the purpose of stability, for the purpose of peacekeeping, would any of the other superpowers try to escalate China into that extremity? We don't know yet, right? We don't know whether China can actually commit to this extreme posture. I mean, we would like to believe that's not the case, but at the same time, are we willing to take that risk, right? And then China basically, there's an article by Fravel and Medeiros, and they're very renowned scholars in terms of nuclear research, and especially for China's nuclear research. Basically it says that China injected a degree of ambiguity into its doctrine to improve its ability to deter conventional threats to its nuclear weapon assets. And this demands prudent judgment from any potential adversaries, basically. You're not going to want to attack, even with conventional forces, against China's conventional forces, knowing that it can be interlinked with China's nuclear strategy. So by doing this, China doesn't have to build a huge arsenal. Not at all. They can actually just have like a small amount that's mobile, and at the same time they invest more in conventional military capabilities that are still very useful and technologically advanced. But at the same time, they can be interlinked with each other, and they work. China in 2013 increased their military spending by a lot. And although, many would still like to believe that it's not that big of a deal. After all, they're a rising power. It makes sense that they're trying to modernize, trying to catch up. But at the same time, they're making the investments within the right field. They're making it not within the nuclear arsenal directly, but within conventional forces that are auxiliary towards the nuclear forces. So by transitive property, they're actually buttressing their nuclear force, and then the nuclear force in turn also supports their conventional forces. And then this is where China really goes a little bit more on the offensive. So far it still seems a bit defensive in terms of what China's nuclear strategy is. But using what they have, using the small arsenal, they can actually still be more on the offensive and cause more damages here and there. So first of all, if we look at Pakistan, for example. So Pakistan's catalytic posture became asymmetric escalation, and China has a lot to do with it. And I'm going to go into the AQCon network, which actually played a lot of role into making Pakistan an asymmetric escalation model. And then we have Israel also, that's becoming more entrenched within the catalytic posture, demanding the United States to provide more support for them. Why? Because of pressure from the Middle East. But the Middle East has more potential to threaten Israeli forces or Israeli government basically. Why? Because of China's involvement also. I mean, there's going to be a lot of ways that China is doing this, but in particular, I want to highlight AQ Khan, the AQ Khan network. So AQ Khan was a scientist in Pakistan. He was a nuclear scientist. He worked for the government, but then he became involved with the black market. So he began selling nuclear technology from Pakistan to Libya, to Iran, North Korea, and a lot of other countries that are, the suspicion is that there are still many more parties involved, but we don't know all of them yet. But for North Korea, Libya, and Iran, that's confirmed already. So, okay, what does this have to do with China? AQ Khan is actually very intimately linked with China. He's made a lot of visitations to China in terms of doing his research. That's where he gets a lot of the knowledge from. And then most incriminating is the fact that when the technology and the design that he gave to Libya was discovered, it was the model that was used for a Chinese nuclear weapon that was installed, that was tested in October 27, 1966. So it was a Chinese model that he distributed. That's not a good sign. Even worse is the Chinese ministry's response to AQ Khan being discovered in 2004. The foreign ministry spokesperson was saying basically that Islamabad, which is the capital of Pakistan, must investigate this properly and quickly. They were very anxious. Their apprehension became very clear. If they have nothing to do with it, they really didn't need to make any comments whatsoever. But why are they all of a sudden urging Pakistan kind of tackle this problem promptly? People, some scholars, some government officials would like to believe that China does have a link with this. And later on, the U.S. State Department actually declassified some documents. It's called the China, Pakistan, and the Bomb, 1977 to 1997. So there have been investigations from the U.S. government